everything that I just mentioned is represented there in one bore size or another. And we can tell this from the weight of the bullets as well as from the established bore diameter. Now, rifles. With all due respect to the National Rifle Association, and I have been on the cover of their American Rifleman magazine as the American Rifleman. I've never been a member though. As an aside, I taught history, and one of the things that I had to teach was some constitutional history and the like, and I would get challenged by students who automatically assumed that I was a member of the NRA when I was saying things about the reasons for the Second Amendment. And I said, no, I'm not a member. And I kept that separate as my private persona or my private dialogue so that there wasn't a conflict of interest in giving out information to students that might compromise how they would see it. Because some students, if they knew I was a member of the NRA, would immediately start talking about me being biased and hewing the company line and things like that. Okay, at Kings Mountain, the Americans are generally treated as having been armed with rifles, and this is why they won, because the British had muskets. Okay, but I have read at least 3 accounts of Americans who were either mentioned that they were shooting multiple loads from their rifle or from their weapon, and the next day one of them mentions that he almost got knocked down because when he fired his gun, important distinction, realized that he hadn't unloaded it and that he had loaded it with 2 balls every time he shot. If you do this with a rifle, it will blow up. So that's prima facie documentary evidence that not everybody at Kings Mountain was armed with a rifle. Okay, at the second line, the main militia line at Cowpens, okay, these are all militiamen. I think that probably 40% or less were armed with rifles. And the reason for this, me saying this, is that John Eager Howard said, after the volleys started firing, the militia, especially those who were armed with rifles, scarcely had time to get off a second shot. And this means that most of them probably were armed with rifles, not with rifles, but with muskets, because the speed of firing was important. And that 5 volley sequence on the second line probably took 45 seconds or less, because one battalion fired, they skipped a battalion and went from A, C, B, D, A. And if each one fired at a 10-second interval, A had 30 seconds to reload. And that's possible with a rifle too. But the British interrupted things by charging. It is possible to load and fire a flintlock rifle. You go bang, and it's possible to get another bang in 15 seconds. I've watched people do it. I can't do that. Okay? But the big problem with a rifle is that they have that incredibly wide variety of calibers, which means that they can't be issued standard ammunition. To operate a rifle, you have to have the mold that makes the bullets for it. And to make the bullets for that rifle, you have to have the lead, and you have to have the time to make that lead into bullets. There's one piece of lead, or maybe silver, that's in that collection back there that shows that they were melting, and they had probably a ladle that was maybe 2.5 inches or 3 inches in diameter. It sat in the dirt, and then they poured the molten metal into the hole in the dirt because they had to do something in a hurry, I guess. So these individual molds have to go with the rifle. Come back to that in a second. They are extremely accurate, but that depends on who is shooting them. And having gone through basic training with rifles, I can assure you that while the weapon itself is extremely accurate, probably 60% of the men shooting it would hardly be qualified as expert. Most of them may be marksmen. Okay, so if you're shooting a rifle and you're not a good shot, it doesn't make any difference how accurate that rifle is. All right, not all the weapons that were called rifles had rifling. They had the form and shape and balance of a rifle, but they didn't have rifling. And this is an important consideration if you're talking about long-range accuracy, and you're also talking about rapid loading. You can load and fire a musket in about 9 to 10 seconds if you take certain shortcuts. Okay, that's 5 seconds faster than you can do a rifle. And this is in the hands of experts. Don't try this at home. Now, how many rifles are available in the Carolina backcountry in 1780 and 81? I don't think there were anywhere near as many as people think. And I think there were probably more rifles at the 225th reenactment anniversary at the Battle of Cowpens than were actually present in the original battle. And the reason for this is that every time there was a battle, the losers and the dead gave up their weapons. And immediately somebody who saw a nice rifle, like James Collins, who was actually given a rifle, I think after Blackstocks, and he was given a little rifle by one of his officers because he had earned it. And Collins makes no mention of the fact that he got the bullet mold with it. So where is he getting the bullets? And this is the problem that I can't resolve, but it's an important one when you're looking at this. And if they're constantly changing hands, somewhere along the line that mold is going to get disappeared. And if you ran away from a battlefield because you were wounded and you dropped your rifle while you were wounded, but you're getting off the battlefield because you're a militiaman, you ran to get on your horse and you're riding hell-bent for leather back to where your home is, your rifle's mold is probably in your haversack. That means that unless somebody has a matching bullet mold, that rifle is, for all intents and purposes, not very usable. Okay, let's look at some battlefield examples. For those of you who have not heard of it, there's a man named Dan Civilich, who's up in upstate New York now, but collected the Monmouth battlefield with a group called Bravo for something like 25 years under the auspices of the New Jersey people who, the state agency that owned it. He's written a book about musket balls. It's an unbelievably useful book. And it's $20 or something in paperback, University of Oklahoma Press. His name is Civilich, S-I-V-I-L-I-C-H. His daughter is also an archaeologist. She couldn't help it. She grew up in it. At Monmouth, these are the bullets that they plotted out from coming into the battlefield in terms of numbers. And these are the calibers in hundredths of an inch. These are almost certainly British musket balls for a Brown Bess musket. The reason that the 75 caliber musket bore takes a ball that's much smaller is that you have a space between the ball and the inside of the barrel so that the bullet can go down. That's more important. When behind the explosive power of the powder charge, it will go out, but you've got to load and fire rapidly. These are the French balls, presumably, and this is an interesting gap here. Under 60 caliber, these are nominally rifle balls, But in the 18th century, the second half of the 18th century, rifle balls from most of the battlefields that I've looked at and where we had good information and some of the rifles still exist, this is the average size, 54. Some of these may be carbine or fusil officers' model muskets. These are intriguing because the small bore rifle is something that's in the 19th century, not in the 18th century. And if you wonder why the Mexicans were able to get over the wall at the Alamo and keep going, is because the rifles that the people who had at the Alamo were shooting 36 caliber balls, and that wasn't enough to stop a charging Mexican. Okay? And yes, they had other bullets too. But Francis Marion is known to have used very large buckshot. And it is possible that when you get down here to about this size, this is actually buckshot. Now, and I'll come back to talk about that in a second too. Engagement sights. These are just a few of them, and looking at them. But every time you look at one of these titles, you're looking at a distinction between the units that are involved. Okay, it's not all like this, where you have lines of infantry standing there firing face to face and with volleys. This was a volley fire of the Mid-Atlantic Battalion at the Yorktown Centennial activity, and what is particularly interesting to me and totally accidental in its being recovered is that this shows the Doppler effect, and the officer who's standing here was facing this way when he gave the order to fire, because the ignitions of these muskets have gone further this way than they have to the men here. That's the Doppler effect. And that's one of those little things that just jump out at you when you're playing with this sort of stuff. Okay, we're talking about campsites and looking at orderly books and some other accounts. I constructed this histogram of activities and camp duration to look at the archaeological potential of military camps in the Southern Campaign for basically an 18-month period. The longer you were in the camp, the more likely there would be an archaeological signature. Most of that archaeological signature consists of privies. And generally speaking, after 1777, if the Army knew it was going to be in a camp for up to 10 days or more than 10 days, they immediately started digging privies, which is a term that they didn't use. They said vaults, sinks, necessaries, houses of office, and a range of other things. But when you look at the kinds of camps that they had, what are you looking at? And the activity that's going there. And for the Continental Army, they almost invariably camped at a mill. What to look for? First off, are there any archaeological signatures? Well, you don't know when you're looking at it because they're buried. Is it a military camp? Well, I don't know. We think it is, but what are the things that would tell you that? Military buttons? Yes. Military marked weapons? Yes. And you go down this checklist of things that might be there. Then you say, is it American? Is it Continental or partisans or just militia? Is it a Marion camp? What would you expect to find in a Marion camp? Or is it British? Is it British regular, provincials, maybe militia? What's likely in the campsite? There are 12 camps that were over 4 days in the Continental Army stay in North and South Carolina in 1780 and 81. Those are the ones that are most likely to have features. The 2 or 3 longest ones were at Hicks Creek on the east side of the PD at Chiraw, and we know exactly where it was, and it has not been collected because the landowner, as far as I know, has never allowed anybody to get on that property. Is that right, Steve?
As far as we know.
Right. Okay. There were 2 camps at Hillsborough, and we know roughly where that is because of the ground arrangement. Stuff has come out of Hillsborough that makes me think that somebody is into it, but nobody knows for sure. The other camps, and one of them has been searched for by the Park Service repeatedly, is at 96, and at least 4 major efforts to locate Green's Continental Camp at 96, where not only did they stay there for some 20 days, but they also had a complete new reissue of uniforms on the 10th and 11th of June. And that means that they disposed of a lot of junk. None of this has ever been found. And this is a force of probably some 1,500 to 1,800 men. Okay, when you look at these, and 96 is complicated. 96 has an early war engagement, okay? There's evidence of a siege, but nothing's been found. Nothing has been found on any of these camps that they think that they know where they are. Okay, at a British camp, these are the diameters that you'd expect. Right here, fusils or pistols, maybe a rifle or 2. That could be, if there's only one of them, it might be a bullet from a Ferguson rifle, but I doubt it. That go to. Here's a Continental Army camp. This is getting into the Brown Bess size. These are certainly the French Charleville size. And these are presumably rifles, but they may also be pistol or carbine balls, which would also likely be found in a British site. Then we have buck and ball. Washington in 1777 said that the American infantrymen can't hit anything, basically. So to increase lethality, he issued orders that they would have buck and ball, that is 3 buckshot in every round with the big bullet that was normally assigned to that. And here's the ball size from the big bullets. These are probably from fusils. And here's the buckshot, and it runs from 26 to 34 caliber. But there's some big stuff there too. Gang molds. There's been questions about how they're molding this stuff up. If you look at this one, there's the buckshot, and there's the bullets. But there are 3 different sized musket balls in that collection. On this one, you have 2 different musket ball sizes, and all of the buckshot is about, I think it was 28 caliber. These are original molds, and I've cast bullets in both of them. This is what a buck and ball round looks like when you see it. This is what it looks like at 20 yards when it hits a man-sized silhouette with 1 shot. And the North Carolina troops in the French and Indian War and in the Revolutionary War fired buckshot that had 7 buckshot with their buck and ball rounds. And they did the same thing at Camden. And their buckshot, because they were probably armed with Brown Besses, was probably about 36 caliber. But any one of these shots would have been lethal. A heart, these in the gut, that one's right below the heart. This one is dead center. Buckshot is great out to 35 yards, and then it tends to scatter so much that at 50 yards, while the big bullet is hitting the small bullets, the buckshot can be anywhere, and most of them are no longer effective. The difference between American and British lead, and I'm not going to put a lot of stock in this because we haven't tested it, but Michael Seibert, who works for the Park Service, has done a couple of interesting X-ray fluorescent tests of bullets. And we're applying this at Cowpens now to see if it holds up on a southern battlefield. Excuse me. The interesting thing is that when you look here, there's one element that appears, and it's only found with the American bullets. It doesn't appear with the British bullets. And he was specific in looking for this because they had X-rayed some pieces of the statue of George III that was pulled down the week of the Declaration of Independence being announced in New York City and taken to Connecticut and turned into bullets. This was in 1776. Almost 2 years later, they found at Monmouth, they found 7 American bullets in .69 caliber that matched the signature of the statue. Now, if the American Army is getting their lead from one source, and everybody seems to be convinced that for the most part it is the Chisel lead mines up in southwestern Virginia, this should be an easy enough signature to duplicate. We've got some samples of bullets that weren't fired and are in a cluster of bullets that can be reasonably well dated. We can test it against this. Until we do that, I'm not sure that we can say that the British bullets and the American bullets are different based on the presence or absence of tin, but it's a neat way to look at it. Francis Marion's camps. I used that 1781 section of the Francis Marion Orderly books, which is almost certainly from a detachment of Marion's command, and looked at it. His unit size at any one of these camps is 200. Almost certainly, usually only about 40 or 50 with this detachment. They have camp names, and sometimes they're a little bit more specific. They have a name, and it's in the district of St. Stephen's, and there are various plantations. More importantly, like the Continental Army camp, they're at mills. Why would they want to be camping at ferries? Because you can float stuff down river or bring it up river to get there. It also provides an immediate opportunity to escape under pressure if you can't stand and fight. Swamps. I don't know very many people have done a lot of research in trying to conduct archaeological surveys with metal detectors in swamps. But there's ample opportunity if they ever develop a really usable underwater metal detector that will dodge around cypress knees and the like. There's Marion's 1781 camps. And you see, these are the 4 2-night camps. These are ones that are 3 nights or more. These are all 1-night camps. There's repeated visits to some of these, but it's only a 1-night camp. Why is he moving so much? I'll wager that part of it may be tactical in that they're maneuvering to take an advantage of where the British might be, but it's far more likely that they're trying to get forage for their horses and, just as importantly, food for themselves. The extraction sites where they may be attempting to do more are these here. Okay, so where do we go from here? If we're looking at single sites, be they battlefields or camps or any number of other kinds of things, we need a bunch of them. Otherwise, we won't know if what we're looking at is typical or different. If we're looking at an extraction site, like a mill, the mill may be easy to find. There's a mill at High Rock Ford on the Haw River in North Carolina, and right next to it is a beautiful terrace that's well above the water levels, and it's got the space to handle all of Greene's army when it was only about 3,000 men. It's now overgrown with trees. But the mill site is clearly known. They're camping at mills because if you camp at the mill, you're going to be able to process all the forage and the grain that you're bringing in from the surrounding countryside. You also have a lot of open space because the trees have all been cut down because mills don't just grind grain. And the other part is that you can camp in a position that allows you to deploy immediately in the case of an attack. Farmsteads. Okay, many farmsteads turned out to be partisan camps, just like the plantations are. But where did they camp on this plantation or farmstead? And if you look at Blackstocks and Braddonsville and Hanging Rock, those places have been looked at. But do you have the partisan camp there? These are also battlefields and they've been examined and we have a general idea. But now it's compromised because it's not just a camp, it's a battlefield. And so you have to, what makes it different from other battlefields as opposed to being a camp, or what makes it a different camp? And these are questions that really have to be answered. If you have regional modeling and you have a bigger sample, the emergence of patterns can happen. But until you have a collection of a wide variety of data, that isn't going to happen. Okay, now I'm going to stop now because some of you are going to have real questions about some of the outrageous things that I've said about various types of sites and the like, and the weaponry, and I want you to be able to leave here at least with some semblance of an answer. But these are the people who made a lot of this possible. One of the multitude of volunteers is sitting over there, Brian Tate. Thank you. Yes, sir.
My question will probably be quite different from everybody else's because of my agricultural background, but regarding cow pens, and I've been at the battlefield a couple of times, and I know that the name of cow pens came as a result of the people in the area using it to feed cattle before going to market, etc. And of course, when I've been at the Battle of Cow Pens with my agricultural background, it didn't look like there was much cattle feed there, etc.
Depends on the time of year, and they're mowing now.
Yeah, well, but there were a lot of trees around too, and of course, when you're just focused on what the National Park Service identifies as the battlefield, you're probably not seeing the whole thing. So my question is, and maybe, I don't know if the picture that you showed in the first slide encompasses it, all of it, but how much of the battlefield covers Hannah's cow pens and vice versa, if you get where I'm going with this question?
Okay, I think that the battlefield is entirely within the perimeter road. When you look at the militia line, Master Tarleton said there were at least 1,000 men in that militia line. That is the line behind the skirmishers. If you pace off from the West Ravine to the area where we found that shot out in the boonies beyond where we thought the battle was, then that is an amount of space that will take 1,000 men plus the skirmishers from the front line who came there. Nobody gave Tarleton credit because if he's saying they had 1,000 men there, well, geez, he only had 1,200 men and the Continentals had X number of men and he got whooped. And that means he's trying to make an excuse. Well, statistically, there were at least 2,000 men on that battlefield on the American side. And that's probably understating it. But that battle line of 1,000 men plus for the militia line is certainly right, almost spot on with the way when you add in what we found last August. So that part of the battlefield we're sure is right, at least given the state of knowledge now. The tree cover up there, there was not a bush on the battlefield, according to participants. It was flat as a race ground. And there were trees, and I think the militia line was right at the edge of a thicker growth of trees that was behind them, because Tarleton couldn't see beyond them. And the Continentals who talk about the weather conditions and the arrival of sunlight or daylight are invariably talking maybe 10 to 20 minutes, saying this 10 to 20 minutes later than the people up front where the skirmishers and the militia were. There is a difference. All right, now normally tree cover would make it difficult to operate as dragoons in that area. And I've spent a lot of time talking to Dan Murphy and Lee McGee about that, and I think we're in agreement now that the repeated visits there by Ferguson twice, the Georgia refugees, the Over Mountain men, the repeated visits by people traveling to join Morgan, every piece of squaw wood, these are the dead branches, up as high as a man standing on a horse can reach, had been stripped out and used for firewood. If you've ever gone to a Boy Scout camp in a brushy area at the end of Sunday afternoon, it is clear ground. And that's only 2 days. And I would argue that this made it possible not only for Morgan to see from the rear on that high ground back there all the way to the front end of the battlefield, but his cavalrymen who were behind him could also see all the way to the front end of the battlefield. And the only way you can do this with a climax forest is if everything is cleared out underneath. And the cattle, if they were stressed in the wintertime, and deer would be the same, browse bushes and leaves and everything else. And in that